Third-person limited is by far the most popular point of view. It's so widespread that I almost wonder if there's a point in making a video about it. But it is near and dear to my heart in some ways, since I've had a lot of misconceptions on the topic, and I think there's still some disagreement between authors on what really counts as third-person limited. So to start with, what is third-person limited? And I think the easiest and dumbest way to put it might be to say it's first person turned in third person. The basic idea is that you keep all the limitations of first person, which make the story feel more intimate, but you're giving yourself way more freedom of expression by putting it in third person. So if you want to tell a very intimate and personal story, what are some reasons you might choose third person limited over first person? There are probably a lot of potential answers to this, but I'll give you two. The first and most obvious one is that you might simply dislike first person stylistically. A lot of writers find the constant repetition of I or my to look ugly on the page, whereas third person gives you the space to change it up by using both the character's name as well as their pronouns. Think of the sentence, "My hand trembled as I reached out to touch her hair." Some people just hate the way that sounds. They think, his hand trembled as he reached out to touch her hair. Just sounds better. Following this example, we could even ask if it's right that the first-person narrator would mention that his hand is trembling. Unless it's shaking to a disconcerting degree, we might even find it weird that he would list this unnecessary detail. Since we're being told his direct experiences, we might question why he's not more focused on what he's feeling rather than what he's seeing as he reaches out towards her. Saying something like, "My heart stopped as I reached out to touch her hair," makes a lot more sense in first person. Whereas in third person, we are actually seeing the character, so it makes a lot more sense to focus on what they look like as they're doing something, beyond just what they're feeling. If you want to be extremely detailed about how characters look while they're doing something, it's not that you can't accomplish it in first person, it's just that it would be a little bit awkward, given that the focus is just not where it's supposed to be. First person is about translating feelings into poetic language. It's not about describing exactly what you looked like as you were doing something. Another reason to go for third person is if you have a character that can't reasonably or believably function as a first person narrator. Like, imagine you're writing a story about a baby. A baby doesn't have a huge vocabulary. And while it might be funny to do baby talk for a page or two, I don't think an entire book like that would be very readable. So unless it's a comedy where the baby is supposed to be a super genius, or it's somebody narrating their past as a baby, this would obviously work better in third person. And third person limited is a perfect way to keep in some of those character idiosyncrasies without compromising your prose. There is, however, a bit of diversity of opinion when it comes to third person limited. Like there's a strict, purist, by the definition camp, and then you have a more relaxed, libertine camp. Staying with the example from before, a purist might say, well, if the character isn't himself aware in that moment that his hand is trembling, if he's so focused on what he's doing that he isn't registering that detail, then they're already breaking the confines of what third person limited is about. Because, at the end of the day, where does the limited in third person limited come from? It comes from the fact that the narrator is restricted to the knowledge known by the character. You are limited to what your character knows. Technically. As you might be able to tell from my tone, I am not in the purist camp. Sticking to the example from before, I feel that mentioning a character's hand is shaking, even if he isn't fully aware of it, is completely fine. My reasoning is that while I am narrating for this character and I am limited to his experiences, it's more like I'm confined to his body. I might see every part of his body and what he sees. I might hear his thoughts reverberating down to me, which I can express either through quotes or italics. But at the end of the day, I'm also adding a part of myself to what I put down and what I describe, of my own experiences inside of the character. So for that reason, I'm kind of going to go back on something I said when I started this out. I don't think third person limited is just first person in third person. I think there is a deeper layer to it. A part of you as an observer of what you think is worth mentioning, of your directorial vision, is also going to come out. And of course, there are ways to push things even further, in ways that would undoubtedly make a purist disown the idea of this being third-person limited altogether. Say, for example, that we have a blind prisoner sitting in a cell. The prisoner sat on the ground, her cell enmeshed in darkness. A purist would say, okay, you can say it's dark, but since she's blind, you have to explain how she knows that. Is it that she wasn't always blind, and so she understands the concept of darkness, and also that the cold of her cell coincides with it being night out? Basically, a purist will tell you that unless there's an explanation you can offer for how a character might know something, then you can't write it. If you want to come up with some contrived way of doing it, like say our prisoner having a cellmate that informs her that the cell is engulfed in darkness, then you're free to do it. According to purists, if you cannot give a reasonable explanation for how a character knows something, even if it's contrived, even if it's stupid, then it's not actually third-person limited. You cannot explain how the character has that knowledge, so you've broken the rules. You might say, well, it's reasonable to think that by this point in her life, the prisoner has surely experienced enough that she has an idea of what darkness is, and probably knows that if it's dark out, then it's also dark in her cell, duh. So for the sake of simplicity and keeping the narrative going, you're not going to bother with the contrived reason. You're just going to assume that the reader isn't anal and just trusts that there's a reason she knows this, despite being blind. But here's what a purist might say, and in this regard I actually agree with them. How authentic is your novel if your character is blind and you're already starting by describing what things look like? You're writing about a blind person, so you should focus on what they feel. Even if you weren't breaking any rules per se, and they would definitely think that you are, doesn't this kind of defeat the whole purpose? She's blind. Why are you focusing on what things look like? Overall, I do think this is a losing battle for the purists because there are just too many people who don't take this as seriously as they do. To those people, third-person limited isn't so much about seeing exactly through the eyes of the character or experiencing the character, since we could just write in first person if we wanted that, but more about focusing on the character inside and out, almost like we're these companions that get to travel along with them. Let's say, for example, that we're writing a passage about this tall warrior going through the jungle, and we suddenly stop and say that though she doesn't know this yet, there's a giant snake right behind her about to pounce. Does this technically break the rules of third-person limited? Yes, it does. I mean, without a doubt. There's no real debating here. It breaks the rules. The real question is, do you care? To some, this is fair game because the snake is still within her radius. We're not talking about things from the future. We're not talking about what characters think who are millions of miles away. It's right there. It's just behind her instead of in front of her. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that it's not actually third-person limited. It might be close, it might be something like it, but it's not, strictly speaking, third-person limited. But again, the question is, are you reading third-person limited because you want to feel an intimate connection with this character? Or because you're super obsessed about knowing the exact details that they know and you cannot know anything else? Are you willing to accept this breaking of the rules if it adds to the dramatic tension? Most people, I think, would say yes. But that is my opinion, and I'm obviously very biased, so you know what you prefer yourself. However, the people who will tell you that objectively it cannot be third-person limited are correct. It objectively cannot be. It just has so many of the hallmarks that we identify with third-person limited that we're not going to call it anything else because it's still closest to it out of all the things that exist. We're not going to call it omniscient because in one section it broke the rules of third-person limited. That's stupid. To some, third-person limited is really just about demarcating a radius around the character that you have to adhere to. You are still trying to give an intimate and super personal story, but you're also providing additional details that the character might not be aware of and might not be able to perceive, which you think are actually good, that make the story better for the reader, which is kind of the whole point, no? If I had to guess, the majority of people that read third-person limited don't even really know what it is. They probably pick up a book and think, wow, I like this character, she seems nice, and I'm gonna read it. That's it. I think what everybody from every camp would agree on, really, is that you need to know what you're doing. If you don't really know much about writing and you're starting out, if you're still developing your style, then you probably don't fully comprehend why the rules are the way they are and probably shouldn't break them unless you have a very good reason to do so. A truly gifted and talented author could probably write a book that has third-person limited, third-person omniscient, first-person, whatever. It doesn't really matter, because they know exactly what they're doing and why they're using it to achieve a certain effect. But since you're probably not that person, and I know I'm not, you should pick a style that works for you and stick with it. Ideally, you want to pick a style that fits with what you like to write. If you write romance or horror, then first person I'm sure works like a charm. But if you're writing action, then third person limited is probably a lot better for your purposes. Again though, it depends on what you want to emphasize. If you're writing romance but you really just want to describe how pretty the characters are, then you should probably stick with third person limited and not go into first person. Now that we've covered all this ground, can I give you some actual tips on third person limited? I think I can, maybe. The most important thing you need to understand is that third-person limited is not objective. It's not that you are writing in this detached way about the character and you sprinkle in some thoughts that they have every so often. When writing third-person limited, your prose needs to align with your character. Here's an example. Imagine we have a character and he's upset. He just got back from work, he wants to take a nap, but the dogs in the apartment upstairs won't stop barking. Here's an acceptable way we could write this. He lay in bed, arms pressed against his pounding head. The dogs upstairs had been barking since he got home. I'm going to kill those mutts, he thought, and slid out of bed. Now, is that third person limited? The answer is, it could be, but it could also be omniscient, and that's because the prose didn't really align with what the character is feeling. There's no actual indication that this is third person limited yet. Yes, the character is upset, and we got that across. And we do describe what he's doing. But notice that all of this is communicated in this impartial way. The narration doesn't have any color, any feeling, it's just kinda dead. We're describing what's happening, but we're not actually putting the character's thoughts and feelings in the prose itself, which is what we need to do. So how could we make this more personal? How could the prose itself indicate to us immediately that we are dealing with third person limited? Imagine we instead wrote, "Those stupid fucking mutts." He lay in bed, arms pressed against his pounding head. One more bark, and it was gonna fucking explode. "I'm gonna kill those mutts," he thought, and slid out of bed. This is way better. Well, you might disagree, but I definitely think it's way better, and here we have a clear indication that it's third person limited, because the prose itself is infused with the feelings and judgments of this character. They're not just dogs, they're those stupid fucking mutts. He's angry. His head isn't just pounding. One more bark, and it's gonna fucking explode. We get a feeling of his boiling rage from the prose. Even if at this point we didn't add his direct thoughts, we would still know exactly how he feels. So does this mean, for example, that if you're writing about a super misogynistic person, that you should use misogynistic language when describing things in your prose? Yes, absolutely. If you're writing about a misogynist and you want to describe things as a misogynist would see them. In fact, the most important thing you need to keep in mind is who your character is and what they do. Because what they do is going to decide so much about your prose. If your character is into fashion, then they'll probably be aware of brands, of styles, of prices. They will have strong feelings and reactions to these things. Or if you're writing about a character that's a medical professional and they go to a hospital, they're probably going to know what things are. They'll know what they're called, they'll know what they do, they'll know some basic procedures. They will have a level of knowledge and a vocabulary that should be quasi-unattainable for normal people. The converse is also true. If you're writing about a complete idiot that's lost in the woods, don't start name-dropping some weird owl species because you saw it on Twitter and thought it looked cool. Ask yourself, would they be able to recognize it? Would they even know what an owl sounds like? Or what specific name a certain plant or tree goes by? Of course, you can always use this for comedic effect, like a very dumb person knowing something very smart for very bad reasons. Stuff like this can also be used to deepen a character. Like if you have a character that doesn't know anything about nature, but she knows the cries of certain birds because her grandfather used to take her out bird watching. That's a neat little fact that's going to make us feel closer to the character, and it's going to add a layer to her that we didn't expect. As you can tell, the name of the game here is emotional resonance. Generally speaking, your character shouldn't know some weird thing unless it is directly related to the plot in some way. You shouldn't have them know something super specific just because you think it's interesting to mention. That's not a good reason at all. And the emotional resonance is relevant because those are the things we remember. I might remember something if my grandfather showed it to me because I loved him. But I probably won't remember something that I saw on TV once 20 years ago or that I even studied for school because it wasn't terribly important to me. Let's imagine a different scenario. There's a little girl. She's 2. She's outside. She sees a praying mantis. Now, most likely, she doesn't know what that's called, but you are writing from her perspective. So, the question then comes, what do you call it? Do you say it's a praying mantis, or do you just painstakingly describe what is a praying mantis, hoping that the reader gets it? The answer should be obvious. You do not waste the reader's time. You say it's a praying mantis. Unless there is a plot-specific reason, like for example she describes something that looks like a praying mantis and the whole book makes you think it is, but actually it's an alien, then don't say that. Just say it's a praying mantis. The reader should not have their time wasted over something of complete insignificance. Same way if a character passes by a car, even if they're not car enthusiasts, even if they don't know anything about cars at all, it won't hurt if you say it's a Mercedes or a Ford or whatever. There are different levels of specificity that serve very different purposes. If, for example, I say car instead of Porsche, that doesn't really tell me anything. Saying Porsche sets a certain vibe and it tells me a lot about the area. Maybe. I don't know. But it could. And this is such an ordinary descriptor that we wouldn't really care whether or not the character recognizes it as being a Porsche. We know it's a Porsche. The author wants us to know it's a Porsche. That's what really matters. Just remember this. The reader always comes first. Offering something that is compelling and immersive to the reader comes way before other, arguably very minor considerations. Having said that, don't overdo it by going to a way higher level of specificity. Don't start mentioning specific car models and the year of manufacture, okay? That's not necessary for most stories. Because if you add too much information, and it's not information that the character could reasonably know, then it becomes extremely jarring for the reader. If your character is hunting her mother's killer, and she ends up in front of a building that has a Porsche parked outside, you don't need to mention that it's a 911 Carrera. One last thing I want to talk about is zooming in on characters at the beginning of stories. You see, for a very long time I was under a false impression. I thought that if you start a story in third person limited, then you automatically have to mention the character's name. That actually is not true. So, for example, if you wanted to start by saying, "The girl was walking down the mountain path under the shadow of the ancient evergreens, her feeble steps taking her closer to home." "Anya!" a voice cried out. Anya stopped and looked behind her. A while ago I would have said, this can't be third person limited, because we're referring to her as the girl, and technically we are already Anya, right? Turns out that's wrong. It's fine to start out in this way and just zoom in on your character slowly. And just realize that this is really only appropriate for beginnings. You can't, in the middle of a chapter, start calling Anya the girl. Before I go, I should also probably mention head hopping, just because every single creative writing 101 mentions that. As in, if you're writing from the perspective of Jane, you don't abruptly, the very next sentence, move to the perspective of Tom. This is not, by the way, a hard rule. It's mostly about readability. If you're great at switching perspectives and creative and can make it effortless for the reader, go ahead. But if you're not, don't. There's nothing worse as a reader than not knowing who's saying what and what perspective you're following. And even if you think you're really good at it, I would still recommend going for clarity. If, for example, you are writing an epic fantasy and you have a whole host of characters and you absolutely want to use third person limited, then I would suggest confining each of the characters to their own respective chapters. Or, at the very least, if you want to stay within the same scene, I would do a line break to clarify that you are hopping from one point of view to another. This point of view stuff isn't really all that complicated. Even the rules are really there just to help you not confuse the reader. You can write in any person that you like and make any modifications that you find necessary. Just remember, people actually need to read this, so test it out first, see if people understand it with ease, then it's fine. So, best of luck in your writing endeavors.